Alright. Hello and welcome back to another Rational Magic video. Today I'll be going over the upcoming set release of Zendikar Rising. Releases in Arena on September 17th and in paper on the 25th of September. I'm going to go over the set mechanics being introduced in the set. We're seeing Kicker returning. Back from Dominaria, you get to spend an extra mana cost on a spell to have an additional effect. Very good in the late game and definitely a fan favorite mechanic coming back. Landfall is going to be the core focus of the deck. Whenever land enters the battlefield, you get an additional trigger on the card. Can be any number of things. It's very often a stat boost to creatures, but can vary wildly as to what the effect is. Always a very powerful mechanic. Across the history of Magic, getting more lands into play has always been one of the most powerful things you can do in the game, and so getting an added benefit of doing something that is already powerful, like playing lands, is a massive win. And the third mechanic to be focused on in the set is the Party Matters, and this mechanic counts clerics, rogues, warriors, and wizards, up to one of each type in play, to give you some kind of additional, often a discount on a card or an additional effect to a card that you're playing. It is a Creature Matters tribal synergy, so expect a big focus on those four types: cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard. And also in the set, we have double-sided spells that count as lands. And this is going to massively change the terrain of deck building and construction in Limited and outside of Limited. Having spells that can duel as tap lands is pretty amazing. So you have the option of casting the spell, and it could be any type of spell or permanent. We've seen creatures, sorceries, basically most things in the game, and printed at rarities as low as uncommon, and I believe some commons. So a whole bunch of these cards at all sorts of rarities can either be cast as a spell or enter the battlefield tapped as a land. And so that's going to drastically change your deck construction, as it does two things. It protects you against land flood, because you have this utility effect, this dual identity of the lands in your deck, and it also protects you against land screw, because the basic creatures can now come in as lands, which is pretty neat. Going to definitely change the environment of the format. And also coming in, one in every booster pack, there will be a double-sided land. So this can be one of two land types and enters the battlefield untapped as your choice of one of those two lands. Will drastically change the cost of deck construction for those paper players out there. Something that has been sorely lacking in the game for a long time is having an affordable land base. And if you're like me, you absolutely resent spending $10 to $15 per land. Constructing a new deck is just always a painful thing, and really takes away from the budget of any deck that you want to build, and in my opinion just massively limits the game and the scope of access for players. So now when you're constructing future decks, whether you're a standard paper player or a legacy or extended format, commander players especially, you will have a cycle of lands that will be very, very cheap to pick up, that are essentially dual color untapped lands, which is completely unheard of. Massive boon to the game. So happy about this. Going to be excellent. And as for you future box buyers, exclusive to Zendikar Rising, they're bringing back what are called expeditions. And so these will come in the form of box toppers, specifically for the set booster boxes and the collector edition boxes. These will not be available in the normal draft boxes. So these expedition box toppers, there are 30 possible mythic rare lands that you can get as a box topper. So they're including 10 fetch lands, are all being reprinted as box toppers for specifically the set booster boxes and the collector edition boxes, which you will get 2 of in the collector edition. There are 5 fast lands in allied colors. So these are the lands that say if you control 2 or fewer lands at the time, they come in untapped. There will be 5 battle bond lands. These are the multiplayer focused lands. If you have 2 or more opponents, they will enter the battlefield untapped. And 10 essentially random mythic rare lands across the history of Magic are being reprint. And all of these lands have completely new artwork, which are pretty dope. They look amazing. They look really good. So those are the 30 possible box topper expedition lands that you will get upon purchasing a set booster box or collector edition box. 10 fetches, 5 fast lands, 5 battle bond, and 10 random mythic rare lands. And yeah, that about covers it. So moving on to the spoiler review section of the video. Starting with the Angel of Destiny. 5 mana for a Angel Cleric with flying and double strike. Whatever creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you and that player gain that much life. So you have symmetrical life gain attached to a card, which is a somewhat rare effect. Then it says, at the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 life more than your starting life total, each player, Angel of Destiny attacked this turn loses the game. Crazy. So this has some pretty large implications. Symmetrical life gain, pretty unusual. A win con printed on a card. It's something I'm never really a fan of personally. WotC doings when they print win conditions on cards. It just feels gimmicky every time and a little bit cheap. But I don't believe this card is going to be too competitive in the standard. It's just there's rarely a deck that's going to allow you to get 15 more life than your starting life total in at least in serious play. Like maybe it punishes some of the less interactive, like Planeswalker style strategies, but they're going to have answers to creatures for sure. But the greater implications are for extended sets. This card is kind of insane in Commander. If you're in a dedicated life gain deck in Commander, which is already a slower format, it is kind of laughably easy to gain 15 life. And then with a card like Swiftfoot Boots or Lightning Greaves or any kind of hasty enabler, this is a 1-turn win condition. You play this, you give it haste somehow. There is almost guaranteed nothing that's going to deal with a 2/6 double strike flyer on the turn that you play this. And then it triggers on your end step. So the same turn you cast it, if you have at least 15 life, more than your starting life total, each player Angel of Destiny attacked this turn loses the game. So it doesn't even have to get through for damage and hit anyone. It just has to attack. Which is kind of nuts. I do believe this card is going to become one of those just really annoying win cons for Commander decks. It's basically just if you have 5 mana and you play this and you have some kind of enabler like a Swiftfoot Boots, you just won the game on the spot, or you at least killed the player who had attacked. Almost guaranteed. That's just so easy to do. And really, like, kind of puts a bummer on what is already a problematic deck. Like, there are lots of cards that were printed with standard in mind and don't function as intended in a format like Commander, where you already have a very high life total. It's a slower format. You can't afford to be super aggressive because you have 3 other players at the table who are going to kind of check your actions if you get a little bit too greedy with your plays. So, not looking forward to that. But moving on. The Priest of Iona. His power is equal to the number of creatures in your party. So again, this is the Cleric, Rogue, Warrior, or Wizard party. You can count 1 creature type, 1 card for each creature type, and it counts a maximum of 4 creatures. Beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a full party, so all 4 types, target creature gets +1/+1 and gains flying until the end of turn. Actually assembling a full party, I think, is a little bit ambitious. It's overly ambitious. It's kind of unrealistic for you to actually have 4 creatures on board that matter that your opponent hasn't tried to interact with. But that being said, this is a 1-mana spell. And simply the stats that you get for having a 1-mana 2/2 or 3/2 with the benefit of potentially pumping a creature and gaining flying is pretty good. I do think this is a pretty well-costed creature just for its base stats. And aggressive decks will always want to play something like a 1-mana 2/2 or better. Ashia, Soul of the Wild. I hope that's how it's pronounced. His power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control. Non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. So this is a pretty sweet card. It has a very unique effect of turning the creatures in play into forests. So if this only said that its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control, it would be pretty good. We've seen that effect a lot. But the really powerful thing here is just turning non-token creatures into lands. I think that has some pretty major implications. It has some cool synergies. There are other cards in the format that care about lands. And I believe this means that any non-token creature you play will trigger landfall. I believe that's how this will work. Once this card is in effect, anything you play is a forest land in addition to its other type. Any creature, that is. And it will do things like trigger landfall. There are cards that care about the number of lands you have in play that will be multiplied by this. It'll give you a lot of ways to cheat mana. And I think this card has some serious combo potential and feels very, very powerful. It is 5 mana. So at that point in the curve, people should be able to interact with you. But a very cool card, and definitely has some interesting combinations that you could brew up with this card. Coveted Prize for 5 mana. Cost 1 less to cast for each creature in your party. Search your library for a card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. If you have a full party, you may cast this spell with converted mana cost. Cast a spell with converted mana cost 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So we have a 5 mana tutor that's discounted for every member of the party. Realistically, this card will be discounted by 1 or 2 mana. I believe that's reasonable to expect. So that would put it at a 4 or 3 mana tutor, which is fine. Like a 3 mana tutor is getting pretty competitive. And then if you have the ultimate greedy play, the ultimate payoff, you can actually cast this for 1 mana and then tutor something out of your library and then cast any card with CMC 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So pretty cool. It's it feels semi competitive in a format with Grim Tutor. I don't think you'd be playing this too often. Considering you can only, like, realistically you'll discount it by 1 or 2 mana. It's not better than something like Grim Tutor, but it's a pretty fun card, and I can definitely see people trying to make this work. Drana, the Last Blood Chief. For 5 mana, you have a 4/4 flyer. Whenever Drana, the Last Blood Chief attacks, defending player chooses a non-legendary creature card in your graveyard. You return that card from the battlefield, to the battlefield, with a +1 counter on it. That creature is a vampire in addition to its other types. So pretty cool effect. Very flavorful card. Your opponent gets to choose the creature, so they're going to choose the weakest creature in your graveyard. There are definitely ways to fix that. There's a lot of self-exile and ways to limit your own, limit their options by taking things out of your graveyard. Just a value-focused vampire with the cool flavor of resurrecting creatures and then changing their creature type to vampires. Pretty cool. We'll probably find a home. And gotta love the artwork. Just a killer. The full art and the non-full art for this card, I think, are both really sweet. Jace the Mirror Mage for 3 mana with Kicker 2. Enters the battlefield. If Jace was kicked, you create a token copy of Jace Mirror Mage that loses the legendary clause, so you can have 2 of them in play. Has the +1 ability of Scrying 2, and for 0 mana, you can draw a card, reveal it, remove a number of loyalty counters equal to that card's converted mana cost from Jace the Mirror Mage. So this has a pretty sweet dual synergy effect. Ideally, you do want to kick this card. If you're not kicking it, it's perfectly fine. A 3-mana Planeswalker that comes in with 5 loyalty and lets you scry every turn is like pretty good value and lets you smooth out your draws quite effectively. The ideal situation is you cast this for 5, and then what you're able to do is on each of your turns, you tick up one of the Jaces and minus the other. And then just mirror that process so that you always have a Jace who's gaining loyalty and a Jace who's losing loyalty. So that every turn you can draw a card and then reveal it, remove a number of loyalty counters from that equal to the converted mana cost of Jace. So you're like alternating this scry and draw effect. So you scry, you deliberately pick the best card and you draw it on each of your turns by alternating the loyalty of both Planeswalkers. And there's the added benefit that if your opponent can deal with Jace, he can probably only deal with one of them in that turn. It's very difficult to kill 2 Planeswalkers, given the limited amount of interaction. There definitely is more interaction in this set with Planeswalkers, which is pretty nice. I've been seeing a lot of cards with printed clause that it can hit either creatures or Planeswalkers, so pretty happy about that. It's something we need more of, but cool card nonetheless. Kaza, Royal Chaser for 2 mana, has Flying Haste. It is a 1/2. You can tap it. The next instant or sorcery spell you cast this turn cost X less to cast, where X is the number of wizards you control as this ability resolves. Pretty cool card. So this card by itself comes in with haste, so you probably just play it as an aggressive attacker. The turn it comes out. And then you can tap it to discount a spell, which is always very, very powerful, and it has a high ceiling. If you already have somehow filled the board with wizards or wizards tokens, something along those lines, you can just play this card and tap it for a greater discount than the mana you spent on it. It's definitely a scenario where this could work. But this looks like a very competitive combo card that might easily find a home in extended formats. And the Wizard Tribe is one that sees enough support in past sets and in the current set that I think this card could be a pretty heavy hitter. And definitely, I could see this supporting some pretty extreme strategies. Discounting spells is just always powerful, and this guy has a cheap cost, a good stat line, a nice amount of evasion. And even if your opponent removes this, like, you spent 2 mana on it. You're not too sad about that. Legion Angel. Almost made a bad word there. Legion Angel. For 4 mana, you get a 4/3 flyer. When he enters the battlefield, you may reveal a card you can own named Legion Angel from outside the game and put it into your hand. So this is kind of a cool twist on the search your library mechanic. And what this does is it replaces what was like a more cumbersome mechanic. Normally a card like this would have you search your library for a creature type or a named creature, reveal it, put it into your hand, shuffle your library, and that just ends up being a pretty cumbersome process that definitely slows down the game. If you have a lot of effects like this where you're constantly shuffling your library, it definitely affects the pace of the game. So I really like that this just has that smooth transition of reveal the card from your sideboard, it's in your hand, and the game moves on from that point. It is somewhat restrictive, having fewer slots in your sideboard, so it probably won't see heavy constructed play or competitive play for that reason, but still very cool and definitely a powerful card. It's constructed worthy, but I think the downside of reducing the number of flexible cards you can have in your sideboard will probably keep this card out of any kind of competitive play. But pretty cool, and I definitely like just the improvement that this card makes to an existing mechanic in the game in a pretty good way. Pretty nuanced way. And returning, we have a reprint of the Lotus Cobra. Probably one of the more powerful and more played landfall cards. It's a 2-mana 2/1. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, add 1 mana of any color. This card actually got up to a pretty high price in paper, and it's pretty cool, pretty flexible. This is the thing about landfall, is that playing lands is always powerful, and cheating lands into play is always powerful. So when a set focuses on the mechanic landfall, it's like you're being rewarded for something that was already good. And for that reason, it becomes a difficult mechanic to balance, especially in formats like Limited. And it's a similar effect to, for example, in Ikoria, they came back to the cycling mechanic, was like a very popular mechanic that they reprinted and then put a lot of weight behind it in the set. But the problem there was cards with cycling are already good. It's inherent utility that you basically want on any card in your deck. And then when you start giving people payoffs for doing something that is already good, it just pushes that mechanic too far and becomes pretty unbalanced. Like the most powerful deck in Ikoria, as far as Limited goes, and actually in Artisan as well, was just the cycling deck. It's extremely easy to play. It's extremely consistent. And it just blew everything out of the water in terms of power level. And it's because they started printing really, really good payoffs, like Zenith Flare, like 1-mana creatures that grow infinitely, just for drafting around cycling, which is already good. Like, you don't need an incentive to do a good thing for it to be good. It just means that that thing is now way more powerful than anything else in the format. So I do have this fear that with a lot of good landfall cards coming back, the colors that are able to abuse getting extra lands into play, which is already a hugely powerful strategy in any format in the history of Magic, that just gets better. So those Uro decks, those like Uro style of ramp decks that have been hugely abused and just kind of like plaguing Constructed for the longest time, are just going to be like twice as powerful, because they're now going to have insane payoffs for doing the thing they're already doing. So I do like Lotus Cobra. It's a cool card. I think it's pretty healthy for extended formats, but not too excited about what Landfall is going to do to Limited environment. Moving on to the Maul of Skyclaves. For 3 mana, you have an artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature you control. Equipped creature has +2/+2 flying and first strike. Wow. Wow. So this equipment is essentially Dub on steroids. Dub is a 3-mana enchantment that gives something +2/+2. And actually, I don't know if it gives first strike. I thought it did. I thought it was +2/+2 in first strike. Which is a very powerful effect. This is a high enough stat line on its curve to really take over a game in terms of tempo. The risk with playing enchantments is that you lose card advantage if your opponent has an answer to what you're doing. This has no risk. This is just a 3-mana evasive high power stat line that you can throw onto a creature and reuse later with an equip cost of 4, which is high but still reasonable considering you didn't have to spend any mana to equip this. I expect this card will push aggressive strategies to a pretty high extreme. Just being able to consistently play and reuse such a powerful spell. Lots going on there. Nahiri, Heir of the Ancients, for 4 mana. +1 ability, create a 1/1 white core warrior creature token. You may attach an equipment you control to it. So we have the classic Nahiri Equipment Matters synergy going on. -2 ability, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a warrior or equipment card from among them. Put it into your hand. And this is the set that will have lots of warriors. And -3, Heir of the Ancients deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to twice the number of equipments you control. So a kind of cool tribal and permanent type synergy card. I could see people trying this out making it work. I like that there's no emblem here. There's no straight up win the game effect to this card. Just a very good creature and tribal synergy. Planeswalker. Nighthawk Scavenger for 3 mana. So this is a throwback to the Vampire Nighthawk, one of my favorite vampires. Has the same combat abilities of Flying, Death Touch, and Lifelink. But gets a little different, where its power is equal to 1 plus the number of cards among cards in your opponent's graveyard. So baseline of 1, and then just goes up per card in their graveyard. Has the potential to grow very high. This card is kind of insane against any kind of like cycling or spells matter deck, as they're just constantly filling their own graveyard. And the high stat line means this is the type of card that just wins the game if it goes unanswered. Yeah, or gives you an insurmountable lead. Flying, Death Touch, Lifelink. That's a lot of stats for one card, and really this is Vampire Nighthawk, but better, which I never thought I'd say. That was always a crazy good card, but power creep is here. Nissa, Shadowed Buffs, for 4 mana. This is a Planeswalker with Landfall as a static ability. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, put a loyalty counter on Nissa. Excuse me. A landfall, whenever land enters the battlefield under control, put a loyalty counter on Nissa of Shadowed Buffs. It has the +1 ability of untapping a land. You may have it become a 3/3 elemental creature with haste and menace. Until the end of turn, it is still land. So thankfully, this does not just pump out endless 3/3 elementals. It's a pretty good beater. It's an aggressive play on 4 mana, which I like. It doesn't protect itself, but it has a fairly high loyalty to begin with. And then this is definitely a card, like the landfall synergy is going to be very well supported. And this is definitely a card that I think you will see people ultimate the turn it comes down with any kind of land synergy in their deck. And the -5, you may put a creature card with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control onto the battlefield from your hand or graveyard with 2 +1 counters on it. So that was already a pretty strong ability. I do like that it limits you to not cast anything insane. You're not going to like drop Blightsteel Colossus out of your hand too often with this card. But the +2 counters really improve the stat line of whatever you hit with this card. I can just see like the 6/6 questing beasts with haste, death touch, vigilance, and another mile-long stat line, text line, hitting the battlefield off this card. Nissa seems like a great beater, a great recurring strategy that can cheat cards out of your hand or from the graveyard. And I like it a lot. This will be replacing the 4 mana Planeswalker slot that was previously taken up by Vraska in Golgari. So pretty cool card. I think this will find a home. Omnath, Locust of Creation. So for 4 mana, 1 red, green, white, and blue, you get a 4/4 elemental, classic Omnath. When he enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So right there, he already replaces himself, so you don't have to worry about losing value. And he has a landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 4 life. If this is the first time this ability resolves this turn, so the second time you play a land on the same turn, you get 4 mana added to your mana pool. Pretty huge. Pretty huge. So if you, for example, you have this card and you cultivate, then you're getting the first effect of gaining 4 life and the second effect of adding 4 mana to your mana pool. And then the third time, he deals 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker you do not control. So it's not a board wipe. It does a significant amount of damage to planeswalkers and then gets your opponent just a little bit closer to the end of the game. Pretty good value. Every Omnath that's been printed has been pretty good value. This is definitely a card that I could see people building commander decks around. There's always demand for interesting 4-color commanders. Landfall is a very popular mechanic, and this guy does a lot of powerful stuff. So pretty sweet. Aura, Skyclave Hierophant. 4 mana for a 3/3 lifelinker. When Aura, Skyclave Hierophant, or another cleric you control dies, return target cleric card with lesser converted mana cost from your graveyard to the battlefield. So we're seeing the Cleric Matters tribal deck getting some support. It's pretty significant that this card counts itself. So you can almost guarantee that this card will resurrect a cleric if you've been committing to this plan earlier in the game. I can't help but notice with Scavenging Ooze, and there are actually some other powerful graveyard hate effects, but Scavenging Ooze now becoming a staple in the format. It's going to be pretty hard to play cards like Aura Skyclave successfully when your opponent can just so easily exile your creatures and with added benefit to them. So, cool card. I'm pretty interested in the Cleric Matters tribal deck. But I don't think this will be able to survive the era of Scavenging Ooze, at least in Standard, but has cool implications outside of Standard. Core Cleric, Commander, anyone? Pretty good. Relic Robber, for 3 mana, you have a 2/2 haste. When he deals combat damage to a player, that player creates a 0/1 colorless Goblin Construct Artifact Creature token. With this creature can't block, and at the beginning of your upkeep, this creature deals 1 damage to you. So, kind of a cute card, comes down with haste, and then gives your opponent an 0/1 that starts pinging away. This card is very matchup dependent. There are a lot of cases where giving your opponent 0/1, which is essentially just sacrifice fodder, is actually going to benefit them. And I doubt this card is going to compete with better 3-drops in the format, but it might make its way into a Goblin or Rogue Synergy Matters deck. But 3 mana, at 3 mana, red just has really, really powerful spells, and it takes a lot to compete. But kind of a neat gobbo. Roiling Vortex for 2 mana. It's an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, it deals 1 damage to them, so all players. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana were spent to cast that spell, it deals 5 damage to that player. Pretty cool. For a single red mana, your opponents can't gain life this turn. And so you can play this on the stack and just deny life gain for a single red, which is pretty cool. Kind of a tech card. It's nice that this is just a 2 mana win con by itself. Dealing 1 damage every turn. Seems strong enough that it will find a home. It has utility and a win con just in the first and last part of the card. And pretty interesting hate for cheating mana. So I don't exactly know which cards this turns off, but it does seem powerful. Dealing 5 damage is quite a lot. So kind of an interesting tech card that's pretty flexible. It's not often that the second paragraph will take effect. There aren't a whole lot of ways or common ways that people are cheating mana, but it's kind of nice that it's there. And I feel like this is a card that's going to find a home. Skyclave Apparition for 3 mana. It's a 2/2. When Skyclave Apparition enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target non-land, non-token permanent you do not control with CMC 4 or less. Then when he leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates an XX blue illusion creature token where X is the converted mana cost of the exiled card. So this is a pretty cool take on what has been a pretty regularly printed mechanic. We've seen lots of cards at 3 mana that exile something until they leave. But in this case, the fact that they get a token back and not the original card, I think is quite the boon. This feels more competitive than simply exiling a card and having it return. Very often you're punished by enter the battlefield effects when you play that style of card. But this does actually exile permanently and then replace that card with an illusion. So pretty neat. Another spirit being put into standard. There's always that kind of like fringe support for spirit salad, like a spirit tribal deck that isn't really there, but kind of is, but mostly isn't. But cool card. I could see this having a home. Swarm Shambler for 1 green mana. Enters the battlefield with a +1 counter on it. Whenever a creature you control with a +1 counter on it becomes a target of a spell an opponent controls, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. Spend 1 mana, tap it, put a +1 counter on Swarm Shambler. Pretty cool. This card itself is a fungal beast. So this is a nice card that supports what is a common tribal type in extended formats of the fungus. And I could see it going in just about any fungus style of deck in paper, in extended formats. Probably doesn't have a home right now in standard, but might in the future. Yeah, pretty flavorful. You have the symbiotic relationship of fungus and swarm shambler, or fungus and insects, which is neat. Pretty great flavor. Pretty fun card. Taberax, the Hope's Demise. For 3 mana, you have a 2/2 flyer. Taberax has lifelink as long as it has 5 or more +1 counters on it. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, put a +1 counter on Taberax. If it was a cleric, you may draw a card. If you do, you lose 1 life. So another cleric synergy card being printed. It definitely has synergy with the previous cleric we saw. With this common theme of putting your own creatures into the graveyard. So it might be a fun deck to mess around with, but again, there's so much there's so many good reasons to play Graveyard Hate right now in Standard that I don't think the deck will be competitive, but it definitely looks fun. I don't know what sort of church that a demon cleric is going to, but 'tis a thing. Lots of evil clerics in Magic. Tajuru Paragon. For 2 mana, it's a 3/2, so already pretty good stat line. It is an elf, but it also has the creature types of Cleric, Rogue, Warrior, and Wizard. So this is kind of the ultimate support for the Party Matters synergy, as it can count for you. It can count as any one of the counted creature types. You can kick it for 3 mana, so for 5. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, reveal the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a card that shares creature type with it from among them into your hand. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. Pretty nice. This definitely feels like a card that will have a home. The party mechanic, while kind of neat, was already a stretch. It has minor benefits, but it takes cards like this to really push the strategy a little bit further and help you kind of like make ends meet a little bit more often. It has a good stat line, and it has significant effects whether you cast it on 2 or for 5. I like it in both scenarios, and I can definitely see this being a staple of that game plan. Tazri, Beacon of Unity. For 5 mana, you get a 4/6. Cost 1 less for each creature in your party. And they brought back, I'm not sure exactly what to call this, but you can spend a blue, black, red, and a green, or 2 generic mana to replace any of those 1 colors. To look at the top 6 cards of your library, you may reveal up to 2 Cleric, Rogue, Warrior, Wizard, and or Ally cards from among them. Put them into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library. So by spending 4 to 8 mana, you get to refill your hands. Refill your hand with 2 cards from either the party or ally creature type. Yeah. He's a warrior. He is a very aggressive stat line, and he draws you stuff. Tribal decks are pretty simple. They just kind of do the thing. Valk Awakening for 3 mana. Put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library, then draw that many cards. And so this is one of our dual-sided lands. So the flip side of this card is just a red land that says when it enters the battlefield, you can spend 3 life to have it enter untapped. And so that's common among all of the rare style of lands. The uncommon dual-sided lands come in tapped always, and the rare lands you can spend 3 life to have them be in non-tap lands, which is a bit steep. 3 life is quite a lot, but there are definitely decks that are willing to spend that. And then it has this kind of neat draw effect. So it probably finds a home. This one's a little bit more awkward to cast. Simply as an instant, it requires you to have things in your hand that you want to discard in order to get value. So it's not exactly card draw. It's a card draw spell with the condition that you already have cards in hand. It's kind of a counter synergy, a little bit non-intuitive with itself. But it might be powerful enough just with the flexibility of also counting as a mountain. So we'll see. We'll see how these cards do. Zagras, Thief of Heartbeats for 6 mana. It costs 1 less for each creature in your party, so a minimum of 2 mana and a maximum of 6. It's a 4/4 with Flying, Death Touch, and Haste. Other creatures you control have Death Touch. And then it has the Vraska style of ability where creatures with Death Touch that deal damage to Planeswalkers kill them. They can destroy Planeswalkers. So a little bit neat, pretty awesome artwork. It has the Vampire Rogue type. It cares about parties, but I kind of think that this card will be played simply for its aggressive stat line. It's very reasonable that this card will be discounted down to 5 mana and sometimes 3 or less. And it's definitely been apparent from previous sets that a 5 mana 4/4 haste in the air, this in this case having Flying, Death Touch, and Haste, is very competitive, and it's a pretty consistent way to close out games. And the rest of the text on this card is just kind of gravy. And I think just discounting this by 1 mana, if it was simply a 5 mana 4/4 Flying, Haste, Death Touch, it would be pretty playable. But cards like this are going to push an aggressive party style mechanic a little bit over the edge. And definitely looks like a competitive stat line. So, pretty powerful Vampy. And that's, one more. I believe the last spoiler we have today. Pretty cool card. Zerus San the Trickster. For 5 mana, it's a 4/4 with Flash. You can spend 4 mana, return an unblocked attacking rogue you control to its owner's hand, and put Zerus San Trickster from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. When he deals combat damage to a player, you may put target permanent card from your that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So, they are essentially reprinting ninjutsu that cares about rogues, which is kind of neat. I kind of miss ninjutsu having its own its own like keyword text instead of having to read this out every single time, but powerful card. So if you have an unblocked creature for 4 mana, you flash this into play. It replaces the attacking creature. At that point, it is nearly guaranteed to deal damage, and then you can take any permanent card from your opponent's graveyard and put it onto the battlefield under your control. Massively powerful. I think this card is going to be a big staple and definitely a deck that people build around. It's a 4 mana replacement effect that will very consistently resurrect any permanent from your opponent's graveyard. Any permanent. Seems insane. Seems like a fantastic commander. Yeah. And it's pretty cool to see the rogue creature type get some support. Pretty flavorful. Happy to see it, happy to play it. I think this is going to be a fan favorite card that just gets played everywhere. If you'd like to see another review of Zendikar Rising spoilers, or if you noticed any interesting card interactions, please leave a comment below. This has been Rational Magic, and thank you for watching.